Last October, my time as Chief People Officer at Flatiron Health came to an end, and I found myself gearing up to do what I had always done: find the next role and keep those other threads running off the side of the desk, on the margins. But then there was this voice that was not quiet and not subtle, and it was basically like, Ara, stop postponing this. What would you do if you weren't afraid? As this season draws to a close, and as we all move on to the next 25 years, I wanted to leave you with what I took away from my conversations with 7 people who did me the honor of not only being nice, but getting real. Because that's the thing about hosting a podcast. You get to be curious on behalf of your audience, and if you're lucky, you end up learning something about yourself in the process. I continue to be very lucky. We started almost every conversation talking about time, the strange experience of being on the other side of your 40s and feeling like you're still a younger version of yourself. Mayuri said she's surprised every time she looks in the mirror that her 25-year-old self isn't looking back. John talked about being perma-20, even as he's navigating the realities of being a founder in his 40s. Lila, said that she always felt like an older person in a younger body. But looking back more closely, the most iconic younger self she talked about was when she was 33, before she had kids, when she was flying a plane and running a literary magazine and doing all the kinds of things that being unencumbered allows. Rory talked about his son being in 8th grade now and remembering what it felt like to be in 8th grade himself. I think what we were all circling around is continuity. The idea that we're not entirely new people. Like the people we were at 22 are still in there, still curious, maybe still a little reckless, and definitely still capable of being surprised. And it's not necessarily about outgrowing or outrunning those younger selves, but really about figuring out, what do we do with them now? I also noticed that even though I sort of thought about anchoring this season around, college graduation, 2001, a lot of the conversations talked about earlier milestones. Kawa talked about how our generation grew up with catastrophe as a kind of background hum. There was the Challenger explosion, the Cold War, milk carton kids, UNICEF drives, the Gulf War, and yet somehow it didn't break us. We'd watch something terrible on the news and then go outside and ride our bikes. We learned that we needed to hold both things at once, oftentimes without fully understanding either one. And I think that the capacity to absorb difficulty without being defined by it is actually one of the most useful things that our generation got, even if we didn't know at the time how valuable that lesson was. Oh my goodness. And then there was the culture. We were kids growing up on reading rainbows and Saturday morning cartoons. We would get furious about reruns on Thanksgiving. We would wait all week for Thursday night. Mayuri and I both saw Rent when we were 17, and it's still one of the most indelible soundtracks of our friendship and maybe our lives. Sunil had Madonna's Blonde Ambition tour and Pedro Zamora on The Real World as some of his first real queer touchstones. And all of these things mattered. They mattered not only because there were only so many channels, but there were only so many stories. And we were so hungry. We were so hungry and we were absorbing the same ones at the same time. We were also growing up as some of the fastest shifts in technology were taking place. Jeff talked about Saturdays editing his auto-exec bat files. I still don't really know what that means, but I do know what it means to have a stack of floppy disks on hand like John did when he wanted to just run one game on his family PC. More than we would probably want to admit, learned geography thanks to Computer Lab and Oregon Trail and Carmen Sandiego. I loved hearing Kawa talk about having a BlackBerry when she was in Nigeria and felt like she was really moving and shaking. Sunil found community in the Playbill Theater chat room on AOL before he could find it in real life. We weren't digital natives. We were more like digital converts. And we were able to bring our analog sense of curiosity, wonder, what it felt like to wait for something. That all shaped how we used technology, or in some cases, how we didn't. I love that Lila resists being fully connected to her smartphone, and she still manages to get lost every now and then. And here's something that might surprise you. It certainly surprised me when I look back and think about how accomplished each of my guests are. When I asked in the lightning round whether they preferred private ambition or public metrics, the answer was one that they really didn't have to think about. It's private ambition. Because we didn't really grow up performing our lives. I mean, yes, there were school plays and things like that, recitals, band concerts, but there wasn't this broad audience, you know? We made mixtapes or passed notes, but we usually had only one person in mind, and we certainly didn't want those things to go viral. We bought resume paper. I don't know how many of you remember the hard cranes, thicker stock paper. It was expensive. And, you only sent it to a few employers. Or maybe if you were in a creative field, you actually remember going door to door with your portfolio or your slides. But mostly, ambition was something to be quietly carried, acted on privately, and revealed only when you had something real to show for it, or maybe when your parents thought it was real enough to talk about it at a dinner party or a holiday gathering. But then LinkedIn arrived and asked us to narrate our own highlight reels in real time. One of the other things that came up in a number of the conversations this season was September 11th. Mayuri was looking for her first job, with New York as that beacon, the place where her whole imagined life was going to unfold. And then the towers came down. But she started her first job in October in New York City anyway, at the Public Art Fund, putting art back into public spaces while the city was still grieving. She said she saw that job as healing. Beauty became a response to loss. Kawa was in DC. She was a recent grad working at the IMF, making good money, and yet she was sleeping on a cot because she was, I guess, trying to be frugal, trying to be responsible. But on September 12th, she bought a bed because for her, something clicked. You have to live your life as you're going toward your objectives. You can't just wait for them. And I was in law school at NYU and living downtown as a result of making a choice that was less about what I wanted and more about what felt safe. I thought that going to law school would provide financial independence because even though I had been an art history and visual arts major in college, I really wasn't sure that I could stand on my own creativity. Law felt like the better bet. And for a while it was. But September 11th planted a seed. It reminded me that life really isn't forever and that waiting for the right moment is its own kind of gamble. It would still take me a year and 9 months of practicing law to finally see it clearly enough to step gingerly, really gingerly, off the treadmill. A lot of people this season had a version of that same story. A path that was handed to them, or a path that they chose out of fear, or that they followed long past the point where it served them. Rory grew up with implicit expectations shaped by the lives that had been led ahead of him, like his father's. He assumed that he'd end up back in DC doing the expected thing, but he made different choices, and he discovered something along the way, that each deviation from the expected path made the next one easier. Jeff felt the pressure at Cornell to go into finance or consulting, the firms that seemed at the time like the only legitimate answer to the question of what success looked like. The funny thing is that a lot of those firms don't even exist anymore. And so looking back, he said if he could tell his younger self something would be that, there are a lot of paths and it's not always the ones with the most social prestige that are the right ones. John talked about always being driven by making things rather than just practicing. He talked about hitting a wall in his conventional career because he realized that every role was just more of the same. He got tired of the corporate pie eating contest. It took that frustration, along with the encouragement of his wife, who was willing to take the leap with him, to finally start building something of his own. Sunil's story is interesting because he spent years building his dream career in theater marketing. He had to find people, he had to go beyond his family connections. He had to really, really carve his own path. And then one night, he was invited to a Broadway opening and realized he didn't want to go. The dream had changed. So he pivoted. Business school, a new city, a new industry, a new relationship. And then in his own words, he ended up in the suburbs, married, and more actualized than he has ever been, which is certainly not what he would have predicted at 22. I recognize pieces of my journey in all of these stories because what happened to me after I left practicing law was I embarked on a series of nonlinear moves from company to company, role to role, board to board, and a career began to unfold that I definitely hadn't planned for, and I certainly couldn't have imagined. Alongside of it, these other threads were always running in parallel. I was writing novels, I was making art, I was blogging, back when that was a thing. Later, I was building this podcast. But always thinking and asking deeper questions about ambition and identity and what it means to build a life on purpose. For years, I treated those threads as things that had to find space on the side of my desk, because my desk was where I had figured out how to be successful. But what happens when that version of success doesn't fit anymore? Last October, my time as Chief People Officer at Flatiron Health came to an end, and I found myself gearing up to do what I had always done: find the next role and keep those other threads running off the side of the desk, on the margins. But then there was this voice that was not quiet and not subtle, and it was basically like, Ara, stop postponing this. What would you do if you weren't afraid? Okay, I want to be honest. I am still afraid, but I'm not going to postpone what I would do if I weren't. Let me describe or explain. So for years, I've had an easy-ish answer when someone asks what I do. And now I'm building an entirely new version of what I do, and I'm building it in public. And I'm not always sure what the answer is, and I'm not sure where this will lead. But I think to my fellow older founder, John, and something he said in his episode that I keep coming back to. He said, I like to think about, regret the things you did, not the things you wish you had done. And so in that vein, I recently launched Stories Work. It's an executive advisory and coaching practice, and I help people who are navigating reinvention, identity shifts, the moments when the life you've built no longer fully fits who you want to become next. Because like myself and like many of the folks I talked to this season, there are so many people who are successful by external measures and who are feeling stuck, or who need someone to help them figure out what comes next if it's not the thing that they've always done. or just a little bit of courage to not slide back into something that looks right, but doesn't feel right. And for a lot of us, it actually turns out that the map is right there. It's right in front of you. It's often those parts that you kept relegating to the side of the desk, to the margins. That's sometimes the place to start. And that's the thing that surprised me the most this season. I thought I was making a podcast about middle age. That was my starting point. But where I actually ended up is I'm realizing that I basically made a bunch of late night phone calls, right? The type that I would make when I was younger. We'd get on the line, and in between the giggling, there would be real moments, honest moments. Now, look, I haven't been in the same room with Sunil or John since middle school graduation. Kawa moved away when we were 11. Jeff and I go all the way back to nursery school when we were 4 years old and we were selling sticks as pencils. I don't know. We seem to think we had a real business ahead of us. Mayuri was actually one of my first readers. She was so patient. She would let me read aloud some of my very, very rough drafts as I wrote through all of the confusion that was adolescence. I didn't meet Rory until last year, and I didn't meet Lila until we recorded her episode. And yet, every conversation, it just felt like we were picking up somewhere that we had been before, and no time had passed, and all the time in the world was in front of us. I think Mayuri said it best. She was talking about how when she talks to me, she feels transported. And old friends do that. Good friends do that. New friends can do that. They can hold a version of you that predates whatever point you are in your resume, your title, the easy dinner party answer for what you do, the person you are when you don't feel like you have anything to prove. And having a community that includes people who have been there with me from some of my earliest moments is what has made these later deviations and reinventions possible. It is really hard to answer the question, what would you do if you weren't afraid, in a vacuum? Because for me, I need people who will tell me the truth, who will ask me if I'm actually moving towards something or just running away, and who will still be there to cheer or commiserate, depending on what happens as you find out. Jeff said something really generous about me in his episode when we talked. He said that I've always taken a conscious approach to keeping relationships alive. And I'm glad he thinks that of the emails that I send out to my friends periodically. But this podcast is also an expression of that, because this season was as much for me as I hope it was for you. I needed these conversations, and at this moment. And this moment isn't a midlife crisis. It's really just life doing what life does. Being offered a series of chances to answer a question, and maybe more honestly than I did the last time. I love when Rory said, hold fast to what makes you you, but recognize you're going to be open to many versions of that over time. And give yourself grace as those evolve, because each deviation makes the next one easier. Maybe around now is when the arc starts to make sense, but that certainly doesn't mean it's over. Not even close. Not for any of us. If you've been here for all 7 episodes, thank you. You already know what I mean. And if you're just finding us now, go back, give them a listen. Mayuri, Jeff, Sunil, Kawa, John, Rory, and Lila, they each said something in their conversation that I am sure you will probably recognize in yourself, or that you might want to share with someone you care about. Or maybe it will encourage you to take that next step, make the call to the friend you've been wondering about, or just breathe a little more easily. And me, I'm going to keep on launching and growing and sharing. And part of that includes getting back into the studio. Season 4 is coming. So, in the meantime, I'm Ara Tucker. This has been Season 3 of I'm Here Too. Off we go.